Hello and welcome to Dementia Basics Online. This is part 5, Management of Behavioral and Psychological Symptoms of Dementia. Last session in part 4, you learned about those symptoms. Why do they occur? And what type of symptoms are the most common ones in different types of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, dementia with Lewy body, frontotemporal dementia, or vascular dementia. In addition, you'll learn the importance of reacting in the best way to understand them, how important it is for a loved one. During this session, you will learn strategies, tools, and how to cope with these symptoms. Our guest speaker today is Lori Delamalva. She's a neuropsychologist from the Ottawa Hospital. If you have any question, please get ready for the Q&A, and we will discuss and answer those questions for you. Thank you for tuning in, and I will turn over to Dr. Lori, and welcome, Lori.
So basically this section, last week, I think you had a session where you discussed some of these issues already and talked a little bit about the origins. And this session is really focused on what it is that we can do, what are the types of interventions, what are the ways in which we can respond, how do we think and make sense of what's going on so that we can manage these, some of these challenges a little bit better. So that's what we'll be doing for the next hour or so. There will be some concepts that you see in this presentation that you have already met in the session before. We will try to cover some tips on how to address some of these different behaviors. And in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about, well, one aspect is really making sense of what the source of the issues is, and the other is very much on communication. And then how do we deal with these behaviors? And we'll talk about the ABC model that you'll see in a bit, some case studies, and then your questions. Basically, really, there are a few rules of thumb in terms of to keep in mind. And the first really is that, you know, as human beings, we all have patterns of behavior that have really been established over the course of our lifetimes, right? We have habits, experiences, our own you know, our own sort of temperament and so forth. So we have developed ways in which we like to do things, ways in which we fulfill our needs and desires, and habits that are meaningful and activities that are meaningful to us. Well, that doesn't stop just because we develop dementia. So we are basically, so a person with dementia, when they are acting or behaving in, you know, desirable or, you know, difficult, in difficult ways, they are still very much, you know, doing the same thing. They're acting to satisfy their needs. They still, like everyone else, need, you know, connection. They need affection. They need safety and security. They need meaningful activity. And they also are looking for a way to, you know, to relieve, you know, physiological issues or pain, discomfort, and so forth. So that's important to keep in mind. There is something behind all behavior. So the way in which we can help is to, you know, to the best of our ability, to have a sense of that person. If we have a sense of the ways in which they typically behave or typically meet their needs, or, you know, the way that they're motivated to do things and the way they like to do things, that's a big part of the picture, and it helps us to really manage sometimes the situations. And also it's important to try to get into the mindset. What could be happening in this moment? What is the context of this behavior? And how is it that we can help them meet those needs and engage in the world in a way that is most appropriate to getting their needs met? As we do with children, really, you know, and adults as well, you know, sometimes there is behavior which we can simply ignore. And so we don't have to correct everything. We don't have to make everything appropriate. If behaviors are not causing any harm or, you know, damage to themselves, property, or others, then one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is there any need to be intervened? Can we just let this go? So that's an important one to keep in mind as well. So sometimes, someone that was describing their situation described dementia like being abroad, taking a trip abroad, where you are in a strange country, you can't really understand the signs. There's something that you need to do, and you can't understand the signs, and people don't understand you and can't understand what you are saying. So in the same way, if we kind of regard the person with dementia as someone who is navigating through a strange land but is trying to accomplish something, then hanging on to words and knowing what it is, that they might be wanting to do, is there a way that we can use either, an understanding of their preferences and their mindset to help them get what they need and understand where they need to be. Accepting their limitations, of course, not expecting more from them than they need, and providing some gentle guidance in terms of satisfying those needs. So it's an analogy that can sometimes be useful when you think about someone, exhibiting behavior that at first blush is a bit incomprehensible to you. And really, in dealing with specific behaviors, the reason that we are even having this discussion tonight is primarily because we want to try to intervene in the most effective way and use behavioral interventions and sense making and gentle guidance as a way to basically manage a situation so that we can avoid pharmacological intervention, because these should be the first line of intervention. We know that as people get older, and particularly in people with dementia, the impact of medication is very unpredictable, and there can be a lot of adverse side effects that actually create more of an issue in managing than the behavior itself. So it is really important to think about this session as a way in which you are, trying to avoid using medication to solve the problem. But sometimes it is not possible, and sometimes medication is required. And when that happens, what's important there is to be really, really informed about what the risks are and what the advantages and disadvantages are of having medication, and to monitor how effective it is and to take a look at the side effects. And always, as a rule of thumb, try the lowest doses first for the shortest possible amount of time. And in this slide, you see some of the different issues that might require, that have a non-pharmacological approach which can be used, and at times, there are medications that are required. So this is also a concept that you already have familiarity with, so I'm not going to repeat it. You met it, you saw this a week ago. But I think what's important to take away from this, and the way that, the way that it makes sense to me, is I think about our relationships with other people and our interactions with other people as integrated experiences. And what does an integrated experience mean? It basically means that that behavior affects behavior. So how one person behaves affects how another person responds, and vice versa. So if we think about attribution, I think one of the things that we are trying to work with is, okay, what is it in my own response that is going to create the best response in the individual? When I am responding to difficult behavior, in a person with dementia, what I attribute the behavior to is going to make a difference in terms of how I respond to it. So if I decide that I'm going to use dispositional attribution, if for example, some behavior is difficult, I might say, oh, they're so uncooperative, they are so stubborn, they're being really difficult today, they're out of control, versus perhaps saying, something is going on right now that is creating this behavior. And I think what's really important is to figure out what the situation is contributing here. It provides a much more tolerant reaction, and that is going to de-escalate the issue, or at least provide the vehicle, the means by which we can sort of begin to make sense of the issue and problem solve, rather than an unfavorable reaction where maybe we react with stress, and of course our own stress is going to then rub off and affect the other person, and then that sometimes can create an escalation. So the idea of attribution is a really important one to keep in mind, because it is going to make a difference to the solution, to the final outcome of a situation in many cases. Now, I talked about situational attribution and the fact that if we do it that way and we take a much more tolerant approach, it can actually help us to sort of engage in a process of sense making. So when something happens that is sort of outside of what we typically would imagine the response of the person to be, there is a process that we can kind of go through that can help us to try to figure out what it is that's going on and how are we going to be able to deal with it, if not this time, then the next time. So just to sort of give us something tangible to work with. Let's say, for example, that typically there is someone that comes to visit, the person with dementia, and by and large, for the most part, those visits are typically enjoyable. But there are times where those visits really fall flat, and the individual is very aggressive or non-responsive or very crabby, irritable, and just doesn't want to have anything to do with the visitor. So rather than, for example, saying, noticing that and thinking, okay, I need to make sense of this. I'm not going to say that this is dispositional, that they're just being grouchy and grumpy and, not cooperating and not being nice. Rather, I'm going to focus on what happened. What is it about this situation today and the way that the person responded that makes it different from the typical response that they have? What could it be today? So trying to find the label for the issue gives us an idea of what it is that we can try out, a solution that maybe can bring things back in line, on track with the expectations. So for example, well, let's see, you know what, last night they didn't sleep very well. So maybe today they were really tired, and that made them, more grumpy and not really ready for the visit. Another time when the visit is going to happen, I'm going to make sure that, or if a visitor is going to come, I'm going to make sure that the person is well rested the night before. You try that out another time and see if it works or not. And if that's not the issue, then you kind of have to relabel and think, okay, it wasn't that, then what else could it be? That's the idea of sense making. That's the approach that we take. And that's where it's really important to think about it in terms of a situational issue, so that it gives us a way, a pathway to try to problem solve, and in a sense take control, feel much more in control of the situation. Expanding that a little bit, I guess, trying to make sense, there are different factors that can affect behavior. So we know that a person with dementia is going to be much more vulnerable to stressors because of all of the different changes that occur with dementia. So one of the things that we need to think about is, okay, what might be contributing? So I talked about sleep, for example, in the individual. So that would be a patient factor. That's something that maybe is an unmet need on their part. They're too tired. It may be, or is it that I've tried to arrange a visit and, with someone, and that the person with dementia is someone who never really enjoyed having visitors. So maybe that wasn't, necessarily the best thing, the best activity for them. Or is it that that particular day they may be fighting a bug of some kind? Or is it that, there's a break in the routine, and usually a visitor comes at a certain time of day, and this time, well, that's more environmental actually, but, is it that something is different in the routine, or have they been really isolated for a long time, and so because of that, they're not, they're not ready to interact. So is it related to the patient? That was one area where some of these, these factors can be leading to stress. It could also be another contributing factor could be the caregiver. If we're talking about ourselves, Is it that, is it something in us that is creating some stress in the individual? Because perhaps with all our best intentions, we are really tired, or we are just too out of steam, to do the next best thing. Is it that we expected something from them that maybe is not something that they can give? So we need to educate ourselves a little bit better about what we can expect of someone versus not. Someone may not be ready for a visitor if they have really a lot of difficulty expressing themselves. Maybe they've become more and more withdrawn, and so having a visit from someone and having to communicate is not really the best approach or the best activity for them, but we thought it would be a good thing, and we didn't think about the language factor. So it can be something that we have contributed to the situation. And sometimes there can be environmental factors. So for example, is there, in the case of that visitor, is it that they came without any notice, so it's not part of a routine, and so they were not expected? Is it that the environment around the visit was very, very loud, and so the person with dementia couldn't focus on what the visitor was saying? Was it the environment? So when we're thinking in terms of that sense-making approach, we have to take a look at all of these different factors. Any one of these could be situational issue: the patient, the caregiver, or the environment. We talk about patient factors and the issue of unmet needs, and I think that this is something that requires a little bit more depth of discussion, because we certainly know that as dementia progresses, we know that communication, both in terms of expression and fluency, the ability to articulate our thoughts, our word finding abilities, as well as receptive skills. So we're maybe more concrete, we are comprehending less well, in conversation. So communication is affected, and our ability to provide for ourselves, so we are more functionally impaired as well. And the combination of the decline in both of those things really creates an increase in unmet needs. There are things that we need, there are things that we need more help with, and we are less able to communicate those unmet needs, and because of that, or those situations, and because of that, then we experience more unmet needs, and all of that then can create difficult, challenging behaviors. And if you think about that, then those behaviors might be the person with dementia trying to fulfill them. So maybe I'm hungry, and so I'm trying to look for food, but I'm looking for food in bedroom cupboards instead of the kitchen, and not being able to communicate, so I'm not able to express it with words, and so I'm more agitated, and I'm maybe acting out, or I'm pulling at my clothes or something like that. It can also be an outcome of the fact that now you have an unmet need, and you have decreased inhibition. So basically, and of course, you have also changes in cognition, and you have someone who is more disinhibited and more apt to do something that perhaps required a different kind of filter before. And so then you have what could be a challenging kind of behavior. Now, in people with dementia, some of the more common unmet needs would include the need for social interaction, which can then lead, to loneliness. Not all people feel lonely if there is not social interaction, but in many cases, social interaction, the loss of it then leads to loneliness and boredom and sensory deprivation. The need for meaningful activity, it is important in individuals with dementia, just as it is for us. A day that is void of anything that creates any sense of pleasure or delight is difficult for someone with dementia, just as it is for us. So there is that needs to be attended to. Discomfort is a very huge unmet need, and they can be very basic physiological needs, needing the bathroom, being overly fatigued, being uncomfortable, being hungry, thirsty, dehydrated. And of course, if we are anxious because we are sort of asunder, we don't have memory, we don't have a sense of structure, so everything is an unknown. There isn't sort of the fence around our thoughts that kind of keep us in line with what's going on. And so there's a lot more anxiety. We worry, and we're sort of at a loss. You don't know what time of the day it is. So many different things can lead to anxiety, as well as the need for relaxation. Sometimes it can be overstimulation and difficulty keeping up with that. The need for control, because we still carry our disposition and our character, and we are, as human beings, there is a need that we have to have a sense of autonomy in our lives. And again, if you think about the losses that result with, in dementia and cognitive changes and functional changes, there's less and less that we can do, and yet something in us is still driving us to, to try to do things in a way that's meaningful to us. So that need for control, and of course pain as well as a physiological need. So learning the signs, and of course your knowledge of what is typical in a person, can really help to understand where this behavior is coming from. So for discomfort, for example, is there something that that you can pin the behavior on that you're familiar with? Basic things like, for example, needing the toilet. Some common signs are agitation and fidgeting and tugging on clothes, wandering, touching the genital area. When we talk about pain, of course, facial expressions, vocalizations, moaning, groaning, and sometimes swearing and screaming and calling out can all be signs that there is pain. Body movements, either very rigid or, kind of withdrawing and being very, very quiet. All of these can also be signs or indicators of discomfort. And how is it that we can, so when we, you think about unmet needs and ways of being proactive and trying to use as much as possible not only our experiences with the individual to understand what's at play, but also our knowledge of the person and our sense making, but using it sort of proactively. What are the types of things that we say, okay, these things can happen under certain situations, so let me see, what can I do to avoid some of that? Because if discomfort is going to create this unmet need, the first line of intervention is trying to prevent it. So keeping a routine, knowing that meal times are at certain times of day, drinking water and sufficient amounts of water, and having scheduled bathroom visits can all be ways in which we can kind of foresee and forestall some of the issues that some of these behaviors that can arise from unmet needs that are attributable to discomfort. Making sure that the health of the person with dementia is checked periodically, so that we are avoiding infections and so forth. Avoiding intake of liquids late in the evening, creates, it sort of helps to avoid issues where there is a lot of agitation and movement around in the nighttime because they're awake, because they need to use the bathroom. And of course, secondary effects of drugs can sometimes also be related to, create discomfort. So knowing that that's an issue, can say, well, they're uncomfortable, they're not themselves today. I wonder if there is, sort of a side effect of a medication, and maybe that's creating the issue. Of course, dehydration is another, which can create confusion and behaviors that are more unpredictable. So some of the signs of dehydration are there, and a good test, of course, is to pinch the skin. And if it stays up after it's released, it's an indication that someone is dehydrated. And dehydration creates lethargy and medical issues, but as well dizziness, and then of course proneness to falls, confusion and a change in mental status, difficulty walking, and rapid heart rate. So obviously making sure that we take care of basic physiological needs is very important. Getting older, and of course, not to mention progressing in dementia, is a recipe for more and more social isolation. So social isolation, and it's often its typical outcome, loneliness, are really becoming a disease, an issue in our times, and there's more and more attention being paid to this issue in the elderly. But of course, someone who has dementia has even less social contact with people in the community. And it is very difficult to sometimes participate in group activities because of some of their functional issues. And of course, the other issue right now, I mean, in the wake of the COVID situation, we're not having opportunities for groups and activities outside of the home. So there's even more isolation. And that, of course, right now is very relevant, and it's something to think about in this conversation tonight, because of course these may not necessarily be conditions that are lifted very, very soon. So we have to get creative in the way that we address social isolation and the effects of it. And of course, there is technology, and of course, which creates its own limitations and its own issues. But I think it's really important to not be daunted by the issues and try to figure out a way to have some meaningful activity. And I think that it's trying to find a balance of the right amount of stimulation, looking for the kind of activity, and that is meaningful and enjoyable to the person with dementia, is really very, very critical. So it may be that you think about past hobbies, their likes and their dislikes, and perhaps there is something online that can be facilitated, by caregivers and others around the person. But also, are there activities even in and around their environment that can be activating? Because behavioral activation is actually an intervention that can be used to decrease a sense of social isolation. And the activity, of course, has to be something, the more akin, the closer it is to the interests of the individual, the more enjoyable it can be. Are there ways in which something can be done, either by telephone? Are there visits that can be scheduled virtually? Are there hobbies that can be pursued, and perhaps something that's kind of discussed with a friend over the phone as well? So are there ways in which we can engage the individual and help to stimulate some kind of socializing around meaningful activity? Now, it is important, as I mentioned in my example of the visit before, that sometimes social interactions are not necessarily what the individual needs, because they worry about being judged by others, because they lose their train of thought, they can't find their words, and they may get frustrated. So it is really important to make sure that that those social interactions are interactions that are tailored to the level of ability of the individual. So whether they are with you, whether they are with friends, whether they are with volunteers, they really need to be at a pace and, at a level and within a context that is enjoyable and manageable for the person with dementia. And obviously these activities are not things that, the activities that we can explore to do together. They should not be activities that focus on learning something new. We're not going to learn a new language together and, remember the grammar and, that type of thing. They should just be things that are very enjoyable in the moment. They're certainly not about competition or hurried or timed activities as well. Now, and In terms of facilitating social interactions, of course, they can be related to the changes in the person, or they can be related to external factors. Sometimes friends or extended family doesn't know how to talk, or they're not comfortable around people with dementia. And so for that reason, there's a falling away of individuals who stay connected. So in that case, it's really important then to reach out and to try and find support for the individual in any way that you can. And that's where some of the services like the Dementia Society can be useful. So what's really important in terms of, being sort of an advocate or a broker of social interactions for your loved one, for someone with dementia, is that you really need to educate people around them so that they're less afraid and they're better able to interact with them so that they're not frustrating them. And also to realize that, it's very normal, both for the person with dementia as for anyone interacting with them, to make mistakes and sometimes, do something that are basically a bit of a miss and are not enjoyable. And that's okay. You just try something else. Um, Reminiscence is a really wonderful way to engage an individual with dementia, because of course the remote memory is still quite intact. And so, going through pictures, if there's a way, either virtually or, if you're able to show a picture, or if you want to talk about an event from a long time ago, or just let them talk about something from the past that they remember, and having a memory box, for example, if you're actually with the person or somebody can visit at this point, within the bubble, is important. I think that I think what I want to mention here before I go on to the next, is that in terms of social interactions and in terms of isolation, I think it's also really, really important to know that it's not just necessary to engage, a person in activities with others and so forth. A lot of loneliness is created also by the way that even we or anybody interacting with the person with dementia is interacting with them. So what's really important are the little things. Make eye contact. Discuss topics that are enjoyable to them, ask about things that are in their past, accomplishments that they had, speak and give them your full attention when they're answering. We can be around someone but not really be engaged with them, and it's the quality of the interaction and not necessarily the quantity, the length, or how many they have. And we see this, even within the hospital. What we try to educate hospital staff about is, in terms of isolation, is to really try to find a way to be present in interactions, to try and make some meaningful conversation, to know something about the individual and engage them in some aspect of themselves so that they can talk a little bit about things that are important or meaningful to them. And just that quality already goes such a long way. So it's just something that I wanted to mention, and I think it's important to note. You don't have to go look for things out there. You're just making the time that you do have the person with dementia in front of someone, virtually or in person, as meaningful as possible. So I said that communication was going to be something that we were going to focus on a bit, and I'm just mindful. I'm checking my time. I'm mindful of the time, and I'm trying very hard to stay on topic and focused. So I want to make sure that we cover everything. But let's talk a little bit about communication. And it is important to know that a person with dementia responds much more to how we say things rather than what it is that we're saying. So, when we talk about those situational stressors and, the different things that can happen, it may be that we're saying all the right words, but think about the way that you are saying them. Perhaps we are rushed. Perhaps someone, that was interacting with them, said something that was fairly courteous in terms of the content, but they said it in a very rushed way, or it was too loud, or it was very curt. So, you know, it's really important to remember that it is how we speak to someone that they respond to. The behavior responds to that much more than even the conversation, the actual content. But when we are speaking, we need to speak clearly. We need to speak slowly. You know, obviously, as I said, nonverbal cues are important. Making sure that we keep our information as concise as possible, avoiding complicated words and run-on sentences, because really working memory is very poor. By the time we finish a roundabout sentence or argument, they may not even remember what it was that we were talking about in the first place. And simple yes or no questions. You know, I always think about, you know, when you ask your child when you pick them up from school, so what did you do today? You know, and they're like, I don't know, nothing. So those can sometimes be frustrating questions when they're open-ended that way. But simple yes or no questions might be better. Did you enjoy your lunch? Did you have you know, a nap? Did you enjoy visiting with so-and-so? So, you know, having a yes or no question sometimes is a cue as well in terms of the content of the question. So I've already talked about making eye contact and even gentle touch and so forth. These are all ways to reassure and, to enhance communication. It's important not to ask um, the person with dementia to make complicated decisions. There should be simple choices, if even choices are given. And if they have difficulty understanding, are there ways to paraphrase? Is there a way to repeat? Is there a way to break the message down into smaller chunks, or change the wording and while at the same time trying to remain calm, or like, oh my God, it's 5 times I tried to tell you this, why you're not getting it? I mean, that might be going on in our minds because we are only human, but how can we do that so that there's a filter there and some of that stress and irritation, you know, it doesn't come through, because in the end what we want to do is we want to try and get you know, try to send positive messages and try to move the situation along. And of course, making, you know, we know that speaking on the phone is somewhat different and difficult than it is to speak to someone face to face. So lip reading goes a long way towards understanding language, and so making sure that you're facing the person at their eye level and that they're able to see what you're saying makes a huge difference to communication. And minimizing distraction around you so that they can focus their attention specifically on you. Obviously, nonverbal communication is what you are going to rely on much more as the disease progresses, and make sure that what you are saying is matched by your body language, you know, that you are trying very much, you know, to perhaps show and say at the same time, and that you, if you're trying to, you know, calm someone down, you're not like, you know, hovering over them in a sort of a threatening position, that you are being reassuring as you're trying to reassure them, that you are perhaps leading them in a certain direction if you want them to move along and follow you. Those types of things, they're all facilitating communication. So I've talked about body language, and obviously that goes without saying. It's a repetition of what I've said. And there can be a postures that is much more threatening. So respecting personal space and making sure that you are at the person's eye level will be really good. The non-threatening stance is one where you are perhaps at a 90-degree angle from the person that you're talking to. You're creating the maximum amount of space with your bodies and not standing over them. There's a sense of openness in that stance. This is called the supportive stance. You're about a leg length away from the person, and you have the extra space there between you. And that is really the most non-threatening stance that you can take if you're trying to communicate with someone. Visual cues, point to objects, as I said, tell and say. use physical contact to communicate care and affection, reassurance. And if you don't know what to do or say, it's important to know that silence is golden. If you are just there and present in a sort of in an empathic way, in a supportive way, it's all you need to do sometimes. When we are listening, it's important to let them finish a sentence and try to give them the time and space that they need, giving full attention, as I said. And when you haven't fully understood, check your understanding. This is what I understood. Is this what you want? Recognize the importance of listening and, as I said before, the value of silence. Now, in terms of boredom, and I think we've covered this already, so I think we can go through this quickly. We're talking really about behavioral activation. Behavioral activation goes a long way towards reducing depression. It goes a long way towards reducing a feeling of isolation and a feeling of loneliness. So you're talking in terms of behavioral activation, you're talking about the types of activities that you can include in someone's day that give them meaning, give them joy, give them a sense of purpose, give them a sense of accomplishment, help them pass the time, stimulate them a little bit. So obviously what is meaningful to them, their likes and dislikes, think about the individual. And obviously someone who has never been a tech wizard is not going to be as maybe won't be enjoying technologically mediated activities as someone who perhaps enjoyed those things before. Someone who you did handwork might enjoy looking at fabrics, touching different things, maybe, making basic crafts, that type of thing. And we're not focusing on performance. The issue here is that the skill may have been forgotten. What you want is simply to create enjoyment, and that's all. Obviously, because new learning is very difficult, you want to do things that are very simple, don't have a time element, that the place where you're working is safe and it's adequate for what they need. You're not looking around for things. It's not too overcrowded or overstimulating where they don't know, what to pick up next. And obviously, your very best intentions might be to have a nice time making cookies, but it just does not work today. Perhaps their mood or their involvement, their motivation, the interest is just not there. That's okay. Be flexible. Do it another time. Sometimes it can work one day and not another. So again, no agenda. All that we're doing is trying to facilitate something. If it doesn't work today, it might work another time. So this anecdote is very interesting. Ronald Reagan's security guards, after he had developed dementia and was living in his own home, used to sprinkle bags of dead leaves on the swimming pool so that when he walked out the next morning, he could rake the water. And it was something that the former president enjoyed before, and in doing it, still obtained a sense of achievement. There's someone that I know who used to, just be adamant about, his job was to sweep the kitchen floor. And so basically putting a broom in the hands of that person and letting them sweep wherever they were was a sense of accomplishment and an activity that they could take pride in and still feel that they were doing something, whether the floor needed to be swept or not. So what are the things that you can think of to keep a person busy? These are on your slides. You will have websites that have some ideas of activities. The other thing that I would say is that one of the things that can be something quite important, and it may facilitate activities with your loved one by others, is to think about, there's a document that can be created and it's called This Is Me, My Story. And basically, I think you can find a template. There are different countries have different templates. And in it, first of all, it's an excellent document if ever the person has to go into either supported living or into the hospital and so forth. But it also is something that's very useful if you have someone come into the home, because then it will discuss likes and dislikes, things that they like to talk about, stories of their past and so forth. You can put pictures in that, and that is something that you can help to create that can accompany the person with dementia, whether you're there or not. So sometimes it's a project that can also be done together. So it's just a little plug there for something that I particularly like. Obviously, everything that I have said hinges on the caregiver and the amount of, sleuthing, the problem solving, the sense making, the thinking that we have to do, the planning. So, it's really important to take care of yourselves as well. It is your right to do that, but it's also something that will help you to have the energy to do these things, and to put these kinds of interventions forward for your loved one. So it is to be stressed that the things that I've talked about before cannot happen without an energetic and focused caregiver, and energy and focus can only come when we are rested, restored, where we have been replenished as well. So it's really quite important to make sure that that's one part of your job, and taking care of yourself is another. That goes without saying. And it's easier said than done, I know. So some different slides that you also will have access to that talk about some resources for respite care. And of course, we're not taking a break. At this point, we're going to go on. It's a difficult format, this virtual format, because it's very hard for me to see any of you. So I don't know how many of you have fallen asleep at your screens. Hopefully not too many. And hopefully we will have time to interact and so forth later on. But, if you need to just stretch your neck or stretch your arms or your back at this time, take a moment to do that. And we'll try to move into the next part, which I hope I'd like to finish within the next few minutes. So basically here, we are talking about, we have talked so far about some of the different unmet needs and some of the things that can give rise to problematic behavior or psychological symptoms. And now we're going to try and talk about some of the issues themselves and hone in a little bit. So I said before that, we have problematic behavior, let's say, and problematic behavior is one that if you don't intervene, possibly might have an adverse outcome. So that's the very first question that you ask yourself. So is this behavior dangerous? Is it not dangerous? Well, you know what? We're going to let this go today. We're going to live to fight another day, and it's not the end of the world. Is it dangerous? Can it possibly be harmful? Yes. Well, I'm going to have to deal with it. So I think that is the way that you kind of take a look at it. Is it causing suffering? If it's causing suffering to the person or someone else, well, it has to be dealt with. Or is this behavior not dangerous? It's not causing suffering, but there's something about this that I don't anticipate. So I wonder if it's related to something that they're trying to communicate to me. Well, if yes, if the answer to that might be yes, again, it's something to deal with. When we look at behavior, we have to place it in context. So behavior is the B in the ABC model. To begin with, there is a trigger. There's usually something that happens, an antecedent, something that precedes the situation. And this is where that idea of sense making that I was talking about comes into play. So what factor could have contributed to this behavior that I didn't anticipate, or this behavior that is something that I have to resolve? Did something happen just before? So you talk about the pieces model, we can see. And then what is the behavior itself? Who is it a problem for? Is it a problem for me, or is it a problem for others around us, or is it a problem for the patient? That is going to tell me a little bit about how I'm going to have to deal with it. When did it start? What happened? So, so all of these are ways in which we can kind of take a look at the ABC model and figure out how we're going to react. Okay, so what happened before, what's going on right now, and the consequence. Now, how did others respond to this behavior? Did that feed into the response? Did it escalate the issue? Or was there something that somebody did that was really useful for me to think about and learn from? Because the way they did that really diffused the situation. So we're always thinking about antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence in trying to make sense. So sometimes, it's something that happens and it kind of takes us off guard. It never happened before, and it's something that has us a bit perplexed. Keeping a journal can sometimes help because it helps with that whole ABC. If I try to think about, this is what happened today, and these were the things, the sort of the circumstances around the event, or this is what kind of happened beforehand, these are the kinds of things that might have had a reason, it might have had an effect and be a reason for the issue. Can the journal help me? Because perhaps the next time it happens, I can begin to see a pattern. So sometimes you can understand, you can find possible triggers for the behavior. We talked about using the pieces approach when you're looking for the antecedents. So the pieces approach is an acronym for, was it something physical? Did they not see something clearly or hear something properly? Are they very tired? Are they physically unwell and in pain? Is there medication that they're taking? So that could be one. Intellectual. Is it that they are not understanding, or this task is beyond them and is now creating a lot of frustration, or they are simply unable to engage? Is it emotional? Are they irritable? Are they so anxious? Is this because they're depressed and so they're apathetic and unresponsive? Is it a matter of their capacities? Again, going back to the intellectual, is it just too much? Are the demands of this way too excessive? Is it the environment? Are there too many people? Is this a change in their routine? Do we have way too much stimulation? Is the lighting poor and they can't see? Or, the social self. So is it that basically there are things that were spiritually meaningful, that they're culturally important, and now they're not able to do these things, and so because of that, or is it something in their past that there was a dislike or a phobia or a fear, or things that they didn't like and were aversive before, that that is a trigger for them? So is it something in their history and in their character? So let's look at some examples very quickly that kind of will put some meat on this whole ABC approach. Here we have Joe. He's 75, he has dementia, and his wife notices that he tends to get agitated later in the morning. She uses the ABC approach. Well, what happens in the morning, the one thing that happens is that the mail carrier comes to the door at about 10:30, and Joe starts to get agitated around that time. So his wife figures, well, you know what, maybe it's the mailman, and what I'm going to do is I'm not going to have him in the house. I'll have him outside at that time. That's maybe one of the things maybe that's the thing that bothers him. So she takes him outside for some fresh air, thinking that that will make the difference because he's avoiding the mailman. But she notices that Joe becomes more upset. So remember the sense making that I talked about before. You notice, you identify, you try, you label it, you try something, and then you might have to relabel because maybe your approach didn't work this down. So she writes this down. She realizes that the mail carrier, the mail carrier was what was distressing Joe, because he felt, so that worked. It means that she realized that maybe he feels scared of possible intruders, but taking him outside only makes him feel more vulnerable. So going outside the house when the mailman is there isn't the answer. The intruder, the fear of the intruder is still there, but it makes it even worse. So she decides to occupy him in another part of the house at that time of the day, so that he misses the mailman completely. Sorry, that was my bad. I thought she took him out to the back, but instead she's taking him out to meet the mailman, and that's the difference there. So here you see the approach. She tried one thing, it didn't quite fit the bill. She realized then, it must be that, but something else on top of it. A 70-year-old, 8-year-old woman with dementia has been in the same nursing home for some time, and all of a sudden she starts becoming extremely agitated on Friday mornings. So this is not an anticipated behavior. This woman never did that before. So if we use the ABC approach, we think, okay, what happens on Friday mornings? So what is the antecedent to her agitation? Well, lately pet therapy began and is happening on Friday mornings. And there are large crowds that gather around the dog that comes to visit. And that's when Mrs. Smith begins to get agitated. So then they think, well, you know what? We're going to avoid the large crowd. What we'll do is we'll keep her in her room so she won't be agitated by the crowd, and we'll bring the dog to her room. When they do that, though, that they find that that doesn't work because she becomes much more agitated. So it's back to the drawing board. What could the issue be if it's not the crowd? So when they bring the dog to the room, she becomes much more agitated. So the staff asks the family, well, what is it about this dog that might be the issue? The family reveals that she was a survivor of a concentration camp, and the dogs used in concentration camps were German Shepherds, and basically the same breed as the dog used in pet therapy. And though they are wonderful animals, they realized that for that patient, that was not working. And so the breed was changed and the agitation went away. So you can see where there might be trial and error in this approach, but having that ABC approach can help you to figure it out. Here are some cases that we can look at very quickly. My dad has Alzheimer's disease. We enjoy gardening together. So, basically she decided that planting flowers was going to be an activity that they could do and would be enjoyable and fulfilling. So they planted some flowers and she happened to walk away. And by the time she got back, she realized that he weeded the entire flower bed and was very pleased with himself. So you think, oh my gosh, I can't be gardening if he pulls out all the things that, that we plant. And so what should she do? Well, the idea was to arrange activities that are meaningful to the person. So the likes and dislikes, hobbies, and so forth. We're not focusing on the performance, and we make use of skills that haven't been forgotten. So as I said, household chores, for example, in the example that I gave before, what's important is that the moment is enjoyed. So you're not necessarily thinking, I'm going to engage him in planting a flower bed. He may not necessarily look at that flower bed as the crowning accomplishment of the activity, right? He is also doing something that he enjoyed, which, just like my husband, is the weeding part as much as anything else. So in this case, what about changing the way that things are done? So he enjoys weeding, so weed together first and then plant and walk away so that he's not left in the flower bed later. So these are some ways in which we think, okay, that didn't quite go the right way. I thought I had an activity that he liked, but how did this not work? Well, maybe it's just a matter of rearranging things a little bit to avoid disaster. Another case, my mom exhibits paranoia, delusions, verbal aggression, especially in situations where she doesn't feel she has any control. So, of course, misplaced money, right? Lost purse. Full denial that she has diminished memory or the logical capacity, problem solve, and yet she confronts us when we suggest tips that would help her. Well, responding to agitation, responding to sort of aggressive behavior, defensive behavior, really requires some de-escalating strategies. One of the things that we don't want to do is to, confront the person and negate their feelings. At that moment, that individual is agitated. At that moment, they are worried that their possessions are missing. So we want to use some reassurance. That's a de-escalating strategy. They are anxious and we want to be present with them in an empathic way that is understanding, that is acknowledging their emotion at that moment, using gentle touch, non-threatening movements, speaking slowly and calmly, should be reassuring, acknowledge their feelings, show them that you want to help. Try to identify, what is it in this situation that created this issue that something is missing? Is there any way that I can avoid that in future? What are the types of things that are, leading to this sort of agitated or aggressive behavior? Frustration, being threatened, loneliness, boredom, worry. They are all underliers of either agitation or aggression. So think about those things. So that might be the emotion behind the behavior. What am I going to do? What might be leading to that emotion? Obviously, one of the, that sort of empathy and kind of defusing the emotion is the first thing. Redirection often will work. So someone who is very agitated, and in our mind needlessly, perhaps want to say, yes, I know you're worried right now. We're going to do our best to take a look at it. We're going to see if we can find that for you. But in the meantime, just, come and sit down for a moment and let's just calm down and look at how beautiful the sky is today. Isn't it gorgeous and sunny? Finding a way to redirect a little bit and take the attention away. Sometimes that is all that's needed, but without minimizing, for like doing that before trying to de-escalate the emotion, because otherwise they're very stuck on that and feel like no one is listening, right? Avoid arguing or attempting to reason. And if initiate physical contact, sometimes if they're agitated, they might think that that's actually threatening behavior. Try very hard to not restrain an individual unless it's really important for safety. And don't show fear, alarm, or even anxiety. And more than anything else, really avoid taking the agitation personally. They are trying to communicate something. Really, it is not an attack at a personal level, although often it feels like it, and often it's even delivered as that. Um, so if there is a delusion, if there is an unfounded fear, an unfounded anxiety, don't argue or try to convince. You'll never be able really to talk a person out of that. Let them know that you've heard the concerns, validate the feeling, as I've said before. Let the person know you care. I can see you're upset. I know you're missing your purse. I'm going to help you find it. You don't have to agree with the delusion. You can listen, let them know you're sorry, see if there's a way that you can change the topic, as I mentioned before. If you can't redirect their attention and there's more and more agitation, try to reassure without asking questions. Well, when was the last time you saw it? Where did you put it down? That's not going to work because they have forgotten that. Just very simply, calmly, try to explain and keep your reactions low key. And think about that response, and if you're able to resolve it this time, think, how can I avoid it for in future? What are the kinds of things that I can do? Sometimes people buy two of the same because there's something that's missed on a regular basis. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm not sure whether we need to go through a vignette that's here, perhaps because perhaps you may have your own vignette. So I think I'm going to opt not to look at this next case, except maybe to say that routine is very, very important, for and it's something that can help them predict what's happening next. And so agitation and anxiety can really be reduced by that. Having things that are very familiar around a person, using signs, using clocks to indicate, when am I leaving? When are you having lunch? When is someone expected home? Anxiety can often be because of memory lapses. So anything that you can do in the environment to ensure that a person has the most structure around them as possible is a very good way. And reducing anxiety can also, if they have sort of common phrases or vocalizations or behaviors, and you can see that that's about anxiety, art therapy, music, these are all very calming activities that you can sort of try to use that can help them to bring that down. Obviously, physical exercise, helping them stay physically fit, or not just physically fit, but engaged physically, and get some of that energy out. If there is a way to do it, will really help to reduce anxiety as well. So I'm going to leave this behind. Let's talk a moment about apathy. So basically, my father does nothing all day. When I get home, nothing's been done, although he says that he'd love to do things. Sometimes apathy, basically people should be encouraged to do activities that are meaningful to them, and that are not overwhelming and excessive in demands. But sometimes what they need is help to get them started. So if you begin an activity with them rather than depending for them to initiate, and small activities at a time, thinking about what time of day it might work best and so forth, leaving cues in plain sight. These are some ways to sometimes stimulate activity and decrease apathy. Having options, but also, kind of having a framework. So, of course, it can also be related to medical conditions, some of the issues. So we do know that if there are things that you are trying that seem to work before that are not working now, is the person unwell? Is there something going on in a medication, or that are, side effects and so forth? So these are all things to keep in mind as well. So, I think that the last few slides, I'm just a little over the time that I hoped to take, but there's so much content and it's so dense. I hope that it was useful to review some of those, and you have your slides. And of course, you have slides with resources at the end of the presentation. And I wonder if now, Herman, is a time for questions. You can, obviously I'm not seeing them, so I'll rely on you.